And good morning, everybody. Welcome to FSC Coach Live. My name is Tim Baghurst, and this morning's guest is Gary Reinl. He's the author of ICED, the Illusionary treatment option. Gary, thank you so much for joining me. I read about your work about 6 months ago, and we had some chats back and forth, and finally you're on my show. I'm really excited you're here. If you wouldn't mind, just give us a little bit of your history and how you got involved in this topic.
Well, first, I'm happy to be here. Thank you. A great entry, by the way. Your graphics just then had my blood running fast. It was great. So what I do is I work with athletes, mostly professional and other elite athletes. And what I try to do is help the athletes avoid injury, and if they become injured, help them recover. But in a very specific area, all I have to do with is the space that happens when you're hurt or before you're hurt, mostly dealing with musculoskeletal, almost exclusively musculoskeletal. And what ends up happening is that there's something in place in the process, in the medical process, called the R.I.C.E protocol.
Mhm.
And the R.I.C.E protocol means rest, ice, compression, elevation. And the R.I.C.E protocol pretty much drives everything that's going to happen next. Well, the problem with that is it's wrong. Now, saying that right up front, I'm not doing that for effect. I'm doing that as a fact. It's wrong. Rest, ice, compression, elevation literally traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. And all you have to do is think that through and realize that if you have congestion in and around the damaged site and you stay still, that will slow down vascular and lymphatic flow. If you make it cold, that will slow down vascular and lymphatic flow even more. If you compress the vessels that the flow is trying to go through, you slow down vascular and lymphatic flow even more. And then if you were to elevate that body part, you've slowed it down even more. Now, why in the world would you want to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies? Well, so far, the thousands and thousands of elite trainers and doctors and therapists that I've spoken with, no one's ever said they want to do that. I said, well, that's what it does. Now, just in case you're saying to yourself, well, who's he to say that the R.I.C.E protocol is wrong? Well, I just showed you why it's wrong, but let me prove it differently. The Harvard-trained doctor, Dr. Gabe Merkin, who made up the R.I.C.E protocol in his 1978 sports medicine book, he made it up. He invented the R.I.C.E protocol. He said, I'm going to call it the R.I.C.E protocol. And Dr. Merkin, after he read my book, publicly recanted, said I made this up, the R.I.C.E protocol, in my 1978 sports medicine book. Research has clearly shown I was wrong. Don't do it. It delays healing, and then gets a specific reference to the fact that it causes additional damage. Dr. Merkin has not only publicly recanted, he then wrote the foreword to the second edition of my book, ICED, the Illusionary treatment option. So when I tell you it's wrong, not only do I say it's wrong, not only can I prove to you it's wrong, unless you think that trapping the waste in and around the damaged site and preventing the natural flow of oxygen and supplies would be a good idea, but the doctor who made it up said it's wrong and wrote the foreword to the book that took down his protocol, which arguably is the most recognized, referenced, and recommended protocol in Western medicine.
Right. And so one of the questions I have is why is it so popular? Is it just because it's easy to remember? Is it because everybody just bought into this idea and wanted to tell parents something? What has caused R.I.C.E to be so popular compared to an alternative option?
Well, Dr. Merkin's book was the first popular book. I don't know anyone who came up at that time that didn't own a copy of his book. It was a white book with the green lettering, the sports medicine book. And I remember when I memorized R.I.C.E, I was so proud of myself. Rest, ice, compression, elevation, I got it. And I was so excited because I got it. And then there was no reason to question it because everyone I knew believed it. It's what you do, except if you would think about it, which I didn't, by the way. I went 20 years or more before I even thought about it. This is what you do. But then when I came to the spot where I began representing a product that promotes active recovery, using the muscle as a pump to move the nourishment and waste through that vascular and lymphatic system, I said, well, how will this work if you're trying to bring good stuff in and take bad stuff out? How would you do that mechanically with electrical stimulation is how we do it. So we electronically walk it off. If you remember the days when you were growing up and coaches told you walk it off, don't sit still, it'll tighten up. Well, all of us who are past that age, you know, if you grew up in the before the year 2000, you were told walk it off, don't sit still, it'll tighten up. Well, all the product does that I work with is it electronically walks it off. So we just found a way to activate the muscles in and around the damaged site to move that nourishment and waste electronically. And what I wanted to do was find the best way to use my product with the R.I.C.E protocol, because the R.I.C.E protocol was there. It couldn't have been wrong. It must be right. So as I began to read, trying to find out the best way to use my product with the R.I.C.E protocol, the more I realized the R.I.C.E protocol was wrong. And at first I was told, Gary, that's career suicide. You can't talk like this. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? It's true. And I remember a few head trainers of major sports franchises saying to me, Gary, if you push this, you're going to get shut out. You're not going to be allowed in the training rooms. And I said, well, I don't know what to do because I know I'm right. So then I began organizing the research. And I read basically everything written on the topic, literally thousands of different articles. Although honestly, if you get down to a couple hundred is all you need to read, because the rest are just rehashes of the others. So you don't really need to read thousands like I did, but I did. I read everything. And I read every clinical textbook I could find. And then went out and interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the most elite therapists, athletic trainers, sports medicine docs in the country, from Apollo Ono's trainer to the physical therapist on the elite military bases, to the pro teams. Everywhere, if you were important, I tried to see you. And then once I got through the first 100 or so, almost everybody would see me because I'd call and say, look, I'm just trying to figure this out. And then I would ask, so do you do the R.I.C.E protocol? And people would say, well, yeah. And I say, so why? Well, what do you mean? Okay, it's not a trick question. Why do you do it? Oh, you know, to prevent swelling. Well, yeah, with what they were taught, but basically they would say to prevent swelling. And I said, really? So how does it prevent swelling? Well, what do you mean? Okay, these aren't trick questions. How does it prevent swelling? Well, it compresses the area and slows down circulation and so, well, okay. So you think it's a good idea to compress vessels and slow down circulation? Oh yeah, it reduces swelling. Well, but wait, wouldn't you be compressing the exit vessels also? So you tell me you're going to compress the vessels to stop it from getting there, but wouldn't that simultaneously, by mechanical design, compress the vessels that help the waste leave? There's no way to compress only the in vessels. You can't take your arm and squeeze it and only compress the in vessels. It's going to compress both. So are you sure you want to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies? Or are you sure you want to do that? And then you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, are you sure you want to even block it from getting there? Like, isn't it supposed to come there? Don't the damaged vessels constrict and the healthy surrounding vessels dilate and increase perfusion? Isn't that what actually happens mechanically and physiologically? Isn't that what goes on? Well, yeah. So are you sure you want to prevent or reduce the flow in? Even if you could only prevent the flow in and not affect the flow out, which you can't, but if you could, are you sure you want to restrict the flow in? Well, yeah, they'd say to me. I said, well, no, but think about that. Are you sure? Do you really want to slow the flow of the repair and cleanup crew to the damaged site? Do you really want to disrupt the flow and the production, the release of the nitric oxide, that pretty much is the mediator, the driver of the tissue regeneration. Are you sure you want to do that? Well, no, I don't think I want to do that. Well, then why are you doing it? But let's just say you did want to do it. You were convinced you should do it. Okay. Is there 10% too much coming, or is there 80% too much coming? Is there 12% too much coming? How much do you want to block? And are hands different than feet? Are you different than me? How are you going to measure that? How will you regulate? How will you know when you've done enough? What about if there wasn't enough to begin with? Should you have more coming if you don't? Well, you can't measure any of those things, can you? So are you sure you want to restrict the flow of the repair and cleanup crew to the damaged site? Are you sure you want to do that? And are you confident that trapping the waste in and around the damaged site and preventing the natural flow of oxygen supplies is a good idea? Well, once I asked that question 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 times, I realized that nobody was willing to defend the R.I.C.E protocol. Nobody would defend it once you ask them. But see, then the more important thing comes. And this was my big breakthrough. And this isn't even in my book. It came after my book. So unfortunately, it's not written in my book. I was told I should write a third edition just to add this point. And I may, by the way. But so here it is. What are you trying to do? Instead of saying I'm going to do the R.I.C.E protocol and I'm going to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies, what are you trying to do? What's your actual goal? Post-trauma, what's your goal? Well, I don't know how many people you've asked that question to, but I've done it thousands of times. And I've never gotten an answer that made much sense to me from anybody, by the way. But then when I give them this potential response, I'll give it to you also, Dr. Tim. How about if the goal was to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed? Would that be a good goal? And I'm asking seriously, would that be a good goal?
Yeah.
So we could all write that down. Our goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. If that's our goal, we can come at it now fresh and clean. So you say to yourself, well, my goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. Okay, what causes further loss? Well, let's just pull it apart real simple. We're going easy steps here. Congestion. Congestion in and around the damaged site will, in fact, suffocate and kill otherwise perfectly healthy cells that were not involved in the initial trauma. So, step one, we want to decongest the area in and around the damaged site. Okay, how does that work? Well, it has to evacuate via the passive lymphatic system. So, how does that work? Well, the passive lymphatic system is passive and nearly fully relying upon muscle activation around those vessels to move the waste through the passive lymphatic system. That's how it works. And you say, so what would happen? Well, when you activate the muscles in and around the damaged site, in effect, it milks the cow backwards. So it pushes the waste up a chamber in the lymphatic vessel. The empty chamber now has a negative pressure that pulls the waste out of the interstitial space and so on. So you milk the cow backwards. So the way you decongest the area in and around the damaged site is by activating the muscles. Okay, so now I have a question, very important question. Do you think sitting still with a bag of ice tightly secured to an area while sticking up in the air is going to move waste to the passive lymphatic system? Simple question, and I'm not going to ask. I'm going to do it rhetorically because I don't want to put you on the spot to answer that. But
I don't like
clearly,
being put on the spot. I've been
all
put
right.
on the
Well,
spot.
so do you think that sitting still with a bag of ice tightly secured to a damaged site while sticking up in the air is going to move waste to a passive lymphatic system?
I would say no, but then I would also ask if we combine R.I.C.E all together, right? As all four are important. What if I just had elevation and I was at rest? Because now I could argue that gravity is supporting this.
Well,
How would
gravity
you?
supports it. Gravity does support the Venus for flow back, but gravity also will compromise the flow too. So if it's helping it return in the circulatory system, then it's inhibiting it on the way out. But how much does it help? not very much, but let's give it a little bit. But that's the blood flow. The damage, the waste, is still caught up in the passive lymphatic system, and you can hang yourself upside down all day long if you want. It's not going to move anything to the passive lymphatic system. That's not how the lymphatic system works.
Mhm.
So the problem with elevation is it doesn't really do what people thought it did, and that's drain the waste. It doesn't. The passive lymphatic system doesn't work like that.
Mhm.
And you go, oh, so let me just keep going with you on this path here. I'll get to elevation. I won't cover it now because we just did, but let me go to the next thing here, and we say, okay, so what else causes additional damage? Well, disuse atrophy. Okay, so what causes disuse atrophy? Well, disuse. All right, so how about if you used it? How about if you activate the muscles in and around the damaged site? And as a result of that, the muscle produces and releases the PGC alpha 1 that blocks or at the very least retards the disuse atrophy. So if you activate the muscles in and around the damaged site, you can again offset, maybe completely, maybe not all, but a good portion of it, of the disuse atrophy as a result of the muscle activation in and around the damaged site that you did to decongest the area. So another big question, step 2 of the question is, do you think that sitting still with a bag of ice tightly secured to the damaged site while sticking it up in the air would prevent or retard disuse atrophy? And again, the answer is, of course not. Okay, so the R.I.C.E protocol is not going to help with the two big problems: the congestion in and around the damaged site that suffocates and kills otherwise perfectly healthy cells that were not involved in the initial trauma. And two, it's not going to do anything to prevent or retard disuse atrophy. So our two big problems you're not solving, but you can solve by simply electronically walking it off, or walking it off as we did since the beginning of time. Then the next big loss, the next big category of loss, is the faulty scarring. And everyone who's studied the topic knows that if you put ice in and around a damaged site, you will increase the collagen deposits. And that will, in fact, limit the flow of the nitric oxide, which will increase the collagen buildup and the faulty scarring. And the faulty scarring will lead directly to loss of function. So that's another category of loss, the loss of functional movement because of the faulty scarring and the lack of reorganizing of the repaired tissue. So
I'm assuming, if I can interrupt, I'm assuming when we talk about
sure.
scarring, we're talking about kind of long-term repetition of this kind of protocol. If I go and sprain my ankle and maybe ice it for a couple of days, that's not going to contribute long-term really to what you're describing. I think what you're describing is an athlete who may be icing on a regular basis or something to that effect. Is that accurate?
No doubt the least use, the least damage. But there is very good information in the literature that say even 2 or 3 20-minute sessions will, in fact, disrupt the process.
Mm.
Now, how much is it disrupted? Well, there are articles in the literature. They're hard to find, but they are there. The New England Journal of Medicine actually had a decent one on the effect of icing in the first week. And see, that becomes one of the problems also. If people say to me, well, what if I only do it twice for 10 minutes and I have 3 towels on top of the ice bag, on top of the skin between the ice bag? Well, then that's not going to do much damage at all. But you didn't make the tissue very cold. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, if you don't do it much, it doesn't cause as much harm.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do it enough, and many people will ice because they're told this, on 20, off 20, on 20, off 20. They'll do that and they'll do it multiple times. Some people will set their alarm clock and wake up at 2 a.m. to ice. So there's this gross misunderstanding where I had one professor at the university say to me when I was giving a lecture. He said, "Well, Gary, you need to understand, by rest we don't mean rest." I said, "By rest you don't mean rest? Well, then so you don't mean rest then?" "Well, no, I'm not saying that." I'm like, "Well, wait, by rest you don't mean rest. What does rest mean then?" Well, we don't mean complete rest. I said, well, then it should say that we're not talking about rest. So then it's not rest. It's something other than that. And the more activation you have, or until you have enough activation to prevent a retarded disuse atrophy, to reorganize and repair tissue, to to decongest the area in and around the damaged site, you don't have enough. Now, once you've accomplished that, once you have enough muscle activation in and around the damaged site to decongest the area, to prevent a retarded disuse atrophy, to reorganize and repair tissue, then you have enough. And so you have a problem on one side. You're saying, well, by rest, I don't mean rest. By making it cold, I don't mean making it cold very often. By compressing it, I don't mean compressing. Well, what do you mean by compressing if you don't mean compressing? Well, I don't mean compressing it. Well, wait, stop. Did it say intermittent compression? See, the problem is I've actually seen athletes, and I suspect you've seen the same. Maybe you yourself or some of your peers that you competed with. I saw an individual roll his ankle on a Saturday afternoon. I'm going to say around 4 p.m. I don't know exactly what time, but it was around 4 p.m. that we were in the training room. I remained in that town on Sunday, and then on Monday morning came back for a follow-up in service. That athlete was wrapped on Saturday afternoon around 4 p.m., told to ice as needed over the weekend, and come back Monday morning and they take a look and see what they're going to do next. When he came back in Monday morning, his ankle was still wrapped, just like it was when he left, never took it off, never did anything any different, iced it multiple times over the weekend. That's normal. That's rephrase. That's common. The athlete did exactly what he was told to do. Ice it as needed, stay off it. Well, that's completely the wrong response if your goal is to decongest the area in and around the damaged site. If your goal is to prevent a retarded disuse atrophy, and if your goal is to reorganize the repair tissue, well, then that's not going to work.
So could
Now,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm okay. Go ahead.
Can we make the same application to things like ice baths and cryotherapy, which may have a different intent? Are they essentially a waste of time and money as well?
Hard to say on that, on the whole question, but the first part of the question is no, it's not the same as the R.I.C.E protocol. So you say, for example, you get in a cryo chamber and I blow very cold air on you for 3 minutes. I did it. I've been in the chamber, and minus 275 degrees is what they blew on me for 3 minutes. And when I was done, they asked me, how do I feel? And I said, well, I feel like you blew cold air on me for 3 minutes. I checked my skin and I wasn't cold. And I wasn't cold once I got out. And there was certainly no depth of penetration of any significance from blowing cold air on me. And if you've never done it, if any of your listeners have never done that, go to the local 7-Eleven and go to the freezer section and open it up. And that first burst of cold air is what it feels like, only it's even colder than that.
Yeah.
But I don't think much actually happens regarding a tissue damage. And I don't think that, well, I've actually been to their national headquarters or international headquarters, and the developers and owners have met with me and spoken with me because they didn't want me to say anything bad about it. They wanted me to know this wasn't the same thing. So they even admit it's not the same thing. And in my book, I didn't go after them at all. I just said, look, be careful, because there have been some athletes damaged from it, wearing wet socks into it and things like that, causing frostbite. There was a death over in Las Vegas where someone really misused it and went in the chamber and apparently dropped their keys to the floor and then passed out and froze to death. So, but that's not cryo chamber's fault. That's just somebody was using it. They shouldn't have been in the place by themselves. And they were in it by themselves, and they thought they were smarter than everybody else, and they died. Well, that's not cryo chamber's fault, but that also has nothing to do with a sprained ankle. And then ice baths. I've done an ice bath only once. I'll never do that again. But I did do an ice bath one time to see what it felt like. And it requires significant discipline. And the people who have told me about it said, Gary, it's a very, very important thing to control and have that kind of discipline. And I go, I agree with that. That's, that's worthy to have discipline to be able to do this. It's not going to kill you. well, it shouldn't kill you. But going into an ice bath, I haven't heard of anybody dying from going into an ice bath. But did it help? Well, did it help do what? Did you ever hear of anybody going into an ice bath for a sprained ankle? I haven't. I suspect somebody may have tried it, but I don't know anyone who ever did it. So it isn't that an ice bath is different than putting a bag of ice on and sitting still and securing it tightly and elevating it. It's not the same category of intent. The literature says that if you go in an ice bath after you train, it will dampen vascular and muscular adaptation. Now, to what degree? Say that. That's not what's referenced. It just says it dampens it. So why does it dampen it? Well, from my understanding, it would dampen it because it would reduce temporarily, but it would reduce the inflammatory response. Well, inflammation, another thing that is kind of messed up in this R.I.C.E protocol thing, inflammation is actually a good, not a bad thing. And if it dampens the inflammatory response, then that would affect the adaptation that you could expect from training. So it's like, well, so bad. It's not the same category of conversation. It's a different thing. If you tell me you're going in an ice bath to bring your core temperature down, well, of course that will work. If you tell me you're going in an ice bath for discipline, well, I have no question. I agree with you. If you tell me you say you feel better without an ice bath and you like how you feel, I'm not going to argue with that. Fine, you feel better. The people who I know who are recommending ice baths who agree with me on what I've discovered regarding the R.I.C.E protocol being wrong say that if you're going to ice bath, don't ice bath after you train because you clearly wouldn't want to happen your adaptation. So ice bath at 5 a.m. if you're going to train at 5 p.m. If you're going to do the opposite, well, then flip it. But don't ice bath after you train. So that kind of was a long answer to your question, but I just want to make sure that people know that I'm not going after ice bath. I'm not going after cryo chambers. I'm simply going after the fact that you shouldn't put ice on damaged tissue and expect it to decongest the area in and around the damaged site, prevent or retard disuse atrophy, and reorganize repair tissue. It's not going to do that. Now okay. Just following, there's two little quick parts just to give you on the end of that. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just don't want to lose the two parts. Once you've accomplished those three big tasks, the three big tasks being to prevent or retard disuse atrophy, that's huge, to reorganize repair tissue, and to decongest the area in and around the damaged site. Now, that's what the further loss is. Remember, our goal, back in the beginning here, the goal was to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. Well, let's get to the regeneration part now, because that's a really important part. You want to regenerate that which has been destroyed. So what drives the regeneration process? Now, remember, we've already decongested the air. We've already prevented or retarded the disuse atrophy, and we've already begun the reorganization of the repaired tissue by putting that tension on the tissue and reorganizing it. Remember, it's inflammation, repair, remodel. So what's the driver of tissue regeneration? Well, loading the tissue, clearly. There's no doubt that loading the tissue is the driver. But the big thing that you've got to do, you got to rebuild the vascular network in and around the damaged site. You got to do that. You have to rebuild the related vascular network. And how do you rebuild the related vascular network? How do you cause that sprouting angiogenesis? Yes, I agree, and it's clearly stated in the literature that the immune system is inherently rebuilding that vascular network. So as soon as you're hurt, it's trying to fix the problem. But you can prompt it, you can stimulate it, and you stimulate it via muscle activation or loading. So the big question then becomes, do you think that sitting still with a bag of ice tightly secured to the area while sticking it up in the air would stimulate the rebuilding of the related vascular network? And again, of course, the answer is no. So it doesn't do that. So the big thing you've got to do, you've got to decongest the area, you got to prevent or retard disuse atrophy, you got to reorganize repair tissue, and you got to rebuild the related vascular network. The R.I.C.E protocol offers nothing in all four categories. Not, in fact, if anything, it not only dampens the process of that I just described, it actually makes things worse in some cases. And it's like, well, wh- who would do that? See, they never stop and said, what are you trying to do? As soon as you write down at the top, I'm trying to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. As soon as you write that down, all you got to do is match what you're doing against it. And then the last thing in my category in my description of this category of healing is myostatin. And myostatin levels elevate from inactivity. Myostatin blocks muscle regeneration. So you've got to lower your myostatin levels. And by the way, anybody who's had heard of myostatin, if you remember, back in the 90s, there was something called Boy Hercules. And if you Google Boy Hercules myostatin, it'll pop right up. And it was a young boy who had very big muscles that didn't have myostatin. And as a result, his muscles grew very, very big. And in the bodybuilding world, they're fully aware of the fact that myostatin inhibits muscle regeneration. And they take something called MyoX, and there's probably other products also that they take to help bring that down. But the best way to bring down your myostatin levels is to activate the muscles in and around the damaged site. And that will lower the myostatin levels, which will then enable the muscle to regenerate. So if your goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed, then you clearly want to activate the muscles in and around the damaged site, whether you call it electronically walking it off with a product like I represent, or you just walk it off like they did since the beginning of time. You get to this spot where you say, well, if that's my goal, if my goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed, and I match up these 5 things, then anything that doesn't do that, I'm probably not going to recommend. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do things that you like to do. You can still do things you like to do. Like, oh, I like a massage afterwards. Great, have a massage. That's not going to hurt anything. I didn't say massage was wrong. I didn't even say a cryo chamber would be wrong. You could go blow cold air on yourself if you want to. It's not going to do anything to facilitate those 5 things. Remember, to decongest air in and around the damaged site, to prevent or retard disuse atrophy, to reorganize repair tissue, to rebuild the related vascular network in and around the damaged site, and to lower your myostatin levels. Going in the cryo chamber is not going to do that. But if you say going there makes you feel better, fine, go in there and feel better. Right. It's not going to cause the problems that the R.I.C.E protocol causes.
Final question. Is there a time or place when icing is appropriate?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you give an example?
I'll give you a real example of something that actually happened that I'm aware of. A 12-year-old or so dislocates their ankle. You're 45 minutes from the hospital. You got a bag of ice and a driver. The child is in enormous pain and scared. Give him a bag of ice and put it on his ankle. It will, in fact, slow down the metabolic process, and it won't swell as fast. It'll make it stop hurting. And when you get to the hospital, it'll be easier to reduce the dislocation because it's not swollen and the patient has calmed down. So it would be a perfect reason to use it. Now, how often does that happen? It doesn't matter how often it happens, it's the perfect time. I have some MMA trainers that I work with, and they said, how about if you get bopped in the first round right above the eye and it starts to swell? Of course, put the ice on it. I didn't say it doesn't slow down. I never suggested that. It simply slows it down so that you could continue the fight and it wouldn't swell as fast. Should you do that? If you're going to do that kind of a game, and that would be what takes you out of the game, and you want to stay in the game, that's not going to hurt anything. I mean, is it going to cause additional damage? Probably not. Putting ice on it between rounds is probably not going to cause it. Maybe a little. You're not going to make it frozen, so you aren't going to. When you put ice on, what you can find in the literature is this: that it delays healing because it slows things down. It increases swelling because it causes a backflow in the lymphatic vessels in the interstitial space, and that it caused additional damage, and that it um, uh, delays the healing process, of course. So you've got this thing where you say, well, does it do that every time? No. No, you have to do it long enough to cause additional damage. You have to do it long enough to increase swelling, to delay the healing. If you don't do it very long, then it doesn't do very much damage and doesn't delay things very much.
Mm.
And then there are people who say, well, I always put a towel on before I put the ice on. I say, well, then it's not going to get very cold, is it? I mean, if you put 3 towels on, it won't get cold at all. So then it's not even relevant to ask the question about, is it causing additional damage? Is it delaying healing? No, you didn't do it enough. That becomes the big issue, is, to me, when I realized the whole thing was just absolute snake oil. There's no protocol. Now, you're in the business and you know this. There's no protocol. You can't go someplace and say, what do I do if I roll my ankle? What's the protocol? Like, how long should I put ice on? How often should I put it on? For how many days in a row should I do it? How cold should I make the tissue? If I have a superficial, say a bone bruise or a deep bone bruise compared to a superficial muscle bruise, do I make it a different temperature? How do I regulate that? How do I measure that? How long do I do it for? Or it's a deep muscle bruise different protocol than a muscle bruise? No one has answers to that. How would you make, say you somehow pulled a deep adductor muscle in your thigh? How would you make it cold enough? How would you make that damaged area cold enough without destroying the superficial muscles? How would you measure it? How would you know when you got to that temperature? See, when there isn't even answers to these fundamental basic questions, you start getting suspicious about the protocol. And you come to it and you go, well, I could put in front of you right now, if we say we're at the National Athletic Trainers meeting or the National Physical Therapy meeting, we could pull 100 people in, and I bet you I can get you 100 different answers. And it's like, well, what's the protocol? We don't have one. Okay, so after 40 years of widespread use and tens of millions of individual treatment sessions, you guys don't have a protocol yet? No, there's not, and there never will be. And by the way, there is nothing in the literature to suggest it's actually beneficial regarding the prevention of further loss and the regeneration of the damaged tissue. So think about that. 40 years of widespread use, tens of millions of individual treatment sessions, and there isn't anything in the literature that says it will decongest the area in and around the damaged site. It'll prevent or retard disuse atrophy. It'll reorganize repaired tissue to prevent the faulty scarring and the lack of functional range, to rebuild the related vascular network in and around the damaged site, and to lower myostatin levels. There's nothing in the literature that says it does that. And you go, well, so why is it still here? It's on its way out. The ice age is over.
And Gary, if people have further questions for you, and I'm sure people watching in future especially will, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
My website, GaryReinl.com, and you just go to the contact, send me a note, and I do my best to return all emails. In fact, just yesterday when I got an email from a retired police officer, and I called him back, and he went, "No way." I said, "Look, if I have time, I called you back. Tell me what the question is." I really try to get to everyone. Now, sometimes, the one interview that I did with a guy named Kelly Starrett from the he's not from the CrossFit world really, but that's where people know him from. He wrote a book called The Supple Leopard, and I did a podcast with Kelly back in February, and we had over 50,000 views in the first 20 hours.
Wow.
I'm really sorry. I could not return it was impossible. I couldn't. But I did send a note back to everyone saying, look, I'm really sorry, but there's just too many right now. So I'm going to try to give a group answer to, these 40 questions that are similar. But you see what happens. I can't, with over 50,000 people viewing it in the first 20 hours, I got buried. But I generally try to get back to everyone. And if you're a coach, a trainer, a doctor, a therapist, um, uh, anybody in the military, I respond to you, and that's basically my rule goes in that order. If you're military or police, I get back to you right away. Everybody else, I try to get to as quick as I can. If 30 people have asked a very similar question, I'm going to answer it in a group.
Well, for those who might be listening to this in future on the podcast, it's Gary Reinl, REINL.com. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining me and sharing a little bit of your expertise and your knowledge about this topic. Very interesting. I'm excited to share it with our students here at FSU, and I hope people do reach out to you with questions.
Hey, who knows? By next time you're Orlando, right?
Tallahassee.
Tallahassee. Okay, with Tallahassee. Oh, FSU. You guys have a couple of my machines there, actually, in your athletic training department.
When you say you guys, athletic training and Seminoles are different to the education wing. So what I may have to do is go down there and find them and investigate.
Well, I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, Gary, thanks again for joining us. Of course, watching, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, Facebook, and so on, so you get notification of when we do go live again. Of course, we'll be here next week for another interview on FSU Coach Live. On behalf of myself, Tim Baghurst, Gary Reinl, thank you so much for watching.